Hello, it's Jillian from Lovely Loops, and today we're going to be talking about recreating an old piece. So this is an old greeting card that I created back in 2015, over 3 years ago, back when we were still Lovely Inspirations. And today I'm going to be talking about some things that I would fix about this, and I'm actually going to recreate this, so I'll rewrite it with a brush pen in 3 different styles for you. But first I wanted to talk about the things that I would fix and some self-critique on this piece. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing is inconsistencies in the letter forms. So if I take a look at, let's just look at the H and the K. So if you look at the ascending stem loop of this H versus this K, you can see some differences. So first of all, this loop right here on the K is much taller and narrower and pointy, so the overall shape is something like that. And then the shape of this loop on the H is definitely shorter. It's rounder at the top versus being kind of pointy in general like that. Also, this one for the H starts higher up on the letter. So if you were to just look at the vertical place where they match up with the stem, this H is starting up, not only is it higher on the stem, but it's also farther away from this piece that connects to the stem, whereas in the K, they're kind of on top of each other. We actually want sort of a happy medium between them. We don't want them to be this far apart, but we also don't want them to be on top of each other. So let's look at the N. The amount of white space in here, or I guess the width of this negative space, is much narrower than the amount of space in here. It almost looks like this is 1.5 to 2 times. Like if I picked up this little piece right here and put it over here, I could probably fit it twice. So we want this space to be much more consistent across the letters. All right, if we look at the O, so this O, the height of this O compared to the height of this O, this one's much taller. They have the same general shape, and I'm not really a fan of this type of O. I'll show you when I recreated a couple different ways that you could make the O. Looking at this now, I don't really like how this loops through like this. I would rather have it come down farther or be a little bit different. I'll show you some different ways you can do that. If we look at this stem of this Y, it should be thick all the way down. We can see that it's thick up to about here, and then it gets kind of thin, but this should really have been thick all the way down, and it's not really a perfectly straight line. We'll talk about ways to recreate that and make it look a little bit better. Again, looking at the thickness of the letters, we can see that this N, the thickness of this downstroke here, is much thinner than some of the other downstrokes. Like this one is a lot thicker, same with this one on top. So the goal is to get as close to the same thickness throughout the letters and words as possible. So if we look at this Y, or this U, you can see should be a little bit wider. Same thing with this N, to match the thickness of some other downstrokes. And then we're completely missing some thickness here on this part of the K. So this K coming down, we can have some shading here. There's also just an overall lack of confidence in the way that I ended the letters. So you can see like this F, I probably now would bring this up further. Lots of these exit strokes just kind of trail off without any real direction, like hoping that the next letter would overlap it enough so you wouldn't notice, but even the end of this U just kind of trails off, is a little bit shaky at the end. So those are all of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of the actual letter forms and the inconsistencies there. There's also just a lot of like minor things too that I would fix. Like for example, this part of the I going to the N, I would make much rounder. There's a lot that I would fix here, but those are kind of the main things. Next, I wanted to talk about the baseline. So if we think about the letters, they should all be resting on the same line, which is called the baseline. And there are some styles where you can play with the baseline or go below it and not stay exactly on it. For example, bounce style. But here, if I sketch in a baseline, there's kind of lots of parts that just kind of randomly go under the baseline, like these N's and even the stem of this K, but it's not very consistent other than the fact that it's only these N's going down. And then down here, the way that this of versus the word you, I can see that the word you is coming down much farther. It's almost like I started to go downhill. Although I started this O higher than this one, so I just was making the word you much bigger, and I just don't really have any sort of consistency with the baseline here. So where this is, where this part is, where this part is, nothing really matches up. So we'll talk about using guidelines when I start to recreate this piece, but it's really important to be intentional about the baseline. You either want to stick right to it and stay on the baseline, or be intentional about where you're breaking that rule. Okay, and then the third thing is the slant of the letters, the slant of the downstrokes. So right here I have a very upright style. If I just look at the general shape of my downstrokes, or the thick ones, I can see they're very upright compared to the baseline. So if you think of like a 90-degree angle, I have my baseline, and then 90-degree perpendicular would be a right angle like this. That's kind of the general shape of my downstrokes. Now I write with more of a slant, so usually around 65-degree slant like this, and using guidelines really helps me to stay consistent with that. But even if I wasn't going to make such an upright lettering style, I would still want to stay consistent. So I think I did a pretty good job here of keeping the same upright style, although I do see some places like this G, the general shape of the downstroke, is going backwards, slanting this way instead of that way, or upright. So if all of mine are upright, the G kind of goes that way. But in general, I think this was fairly consistent, keeping things upright. I guess the general shape of this O is a little bit slanted. So we're going to talk about all of these things when we recreate the piece. I'm going to recreate it in 3 styles. And the reason I'm doing that is to show that it's really important to maintain a cohesive style. So that's kind of like a fourth bonus thing about this, is I don't really have a cohesive style, at least the way that I would think about it now. Some of these elements, like the T and the Y, look a little bit more like I was trying to do a more of a traditional style for these, even though I didn't really know what it was supposed to look like. That looks like what I was aiming for. But then if I look at the O's and the K, they look a little bit more of a loopy, like open loop style, which I wouldn't necessarily pair with a traditional capital. And then finally we have some bounciness going on with the ends as they dip below the baseline and the U here, and that doesn't really go with the rest of the style. So we have several different themes going on just in these 3 words, and I'm going to break those apart into my 3 different recreations of this piece. So let's get started on that. So when we recreate this piece, I'm going to be using guidelines. Now, guidelines are really important for keeping your letters on the same baseline, and then also in these particular ones, I have a slant line that's going to help me maintain a consistent slant throughout the letters. So the horizontal lines will serve as the baseline where the letters are resting on, and then if we have a baseline here, then the line right above it is going to be the top of our X height, which is where the lowercase letters come up to. So the baseline would be this line, the X height would be where these letters come up to, which you can see here isn't super consistent. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm using some guidelines, and I'm going to write on a piece of paper on top of it. So in order to be able to see the guidelines through this sheet of paper, I'm going to use a light pad. So a light pad is probably one of the most useful tools, I think, of when you're doing calligraphy and lettering, not only for practice, but also for final pieces. So mine has a little on switch right here, so when you turn it on, light is going to shine up through here. It might be a little bit hard to tell on camera, but it's just this flat surface. It's pretty thin, so maybe I don't know, 1/4 of an inch thick or less, probably less. And when I put my sheets of paper on top of it, you can see through. So right now the light pad is on. If I turn it off, then it's just my white paper with my guidelines underneath. Now if I turn it back on, you can see the light shining through. So if you've ever held up a piece of paper to a window before, you may have tried something like this. But I highly, highly recommend getting a light pad because it's going to be so helpful to keep things consistent. So I'm going to be using a purple Marvy color in marker, and it's pretty close to the color of what I used here. Like I said, I don't have this brush pen that I originally used anymore, but I'll try to get close to it. So first I'm going to do more of a traditional style of this, and then I'll do a couple more styles. So for the traditional style, so as I use this, I'm rotating my paper a little bit, so my body's here, and I'm rotating my paper so that the guidelines or the slant lines point towards me. You can experiment with this. If you're left-handed, you may need to rotate your paper the opposite way. And I'm just going to use these lines as a guideline. So when I draw my, especially some taller letters like this capital T that I'm about to do, I like to stay along this slant line to help me stay consistent. So I really like how on my original one I had the loop of the H going around the crossbar of the T. Got a little bit of shaky there. And usually in a traditional style, we keep things pretty narrow, not too wide. And usually a little bit different proportion than something more modern. So you can see that my ascending stem loops are going slightly above that second ascender line, or the first ascender line. So if this is the top of my X height, this is the ascender line. So the loop went above. So here for the G, I'm going to try to go that amount below this line right here to keep things consistent. Okay, so since I have these are going slightly above, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift my paper up slightly on the guidelines so that when I make my letters down here, when I make my F, I can still go the same height as these loops and not run into thinking. Okay, so I'm just going to shift this up a little. So for the O, instead of using an open loop here, I'm going to use that closed mini underturn or comma dot. And instead of looping this F back this way, I'm going to finish it off that way. So the beginning of this Y is the same as the beginning of that T, or it should be close. All right, so this compared to this, we can see some differences for sure. I would say the most important thing is that this just looks a lot more consistent and confident, whereas this has a lot more shakiness, a lot more kind of inconsistencies here. I also like how this has more of a consistent slant versus the uprightness of the letters here. And then also I'm using letter forms that match the style. So instead of using an open loop for the O and an open loop for the bottom of the F, I'm keeping things closed off and pretty narrow. Same thing with the K. Instead of using an open loop, it's more of a, actually I think I want to make this dot a little bit bigger like this. And these are all things, and same thing with here, this dot here instead of a loop. So these are all more traditional style lettering elements. So now we're going to do a more of a bouncy style to try to incorporate some of the things that I was using here. So instead of using traditional letter forms, we're going to use more modern ones. And we're still going to use the same X height and guidelines and everything, but we'll start to incorporate some of these other elements. So let's get started. So one thing that I like to do for modern and less traditional letters is not use capitals. So instead of using a capital T and Y, I'm just going to use the lowercase. I'm also going to use some more modern and bouncy lettering. So I'll talk about it as I go. But let's just start off with an entrance stroke for the T, and then I'm going to dip this below the baseline and scoop back up. And then I will connect the crossbar of my T into the H. That's optional, but I just think it's kind of fun. All right, and then let's do the same thing here. Dip the bottom of the H below the baseline. All right, so we're writing thinking of you. So I'm just gonna keep the I. I like to keep the I just on the baseline, not dip it too far below, but then I can bring the N up above that X height. And then I think I'll dip that below as well. So then for this K, let's just do our loop here, and instead of using that traditional style, I'm going to use a loop here as well and bring this below. Like I did here, I'm going to do the same thing for my I and N combination. And then I'll just finish off my G. And one little trick that I have is, especially if this is at the end of a word, I'm going to leave the loop of this. I'm not going to do it yet because I'm going to try to make it a little bit bigger and I don't want to run into the letters under it. So now that I'm going to do of you, since I do have lots of these coming down below, I am going to do similar to what I did before and just shift this up a bit so that I don't run into this line here. So for the O, I'm going to make it pretty loopy. And same thing with the F. I'll make a loop on the top and on the bottom. And then my Y, let's see, like I'm doing for the T, I'm going to do a lowercase y, and I'll go up above the X height. And I kind of know where this line is going to end, so I can go ahead and do that loop here. I'll do this similar style for my O, and then for my U, to make it match this bouncy style, I'll bring the bottom of the U below the baseline. So now I know what kind of space I can take up with this loop of the G, and it seems like I don't have as much room as I thought I would, which is good. I'm glad I waited and didn't make some giant loop here. So I think I'll just go down and then bring this up this way. Okay, so this, I really like this style. It's definitely bouncy and modern and less traditional, but definitely more planned out and cohesive than what we did here. So the parts that dip below the baseline here, I'm still using a similar idea with dipping this part of the end below the baseline, but instead of only having it on the ends, I have a much more well thought out cohesive style here. All right, and then the last style that I wanted to do is pretty different from this. The only thing that I will be adopting from here is the slant. So I'm going to use a little bit more of an upright slant on this last one, and I'm going to make the overall feel a lot more edgy and less traditional, less bouncy, but a little bit more edgy. So I'm using the same guidelines, and even though I have my slant on here, I'm going to try to ignore it. If I really wanted to make this look perfect, I would probably go ahead and print different guidelines to use. But for now, I'll kind of use this as a guide and say, okay, I'm gonna go a little bit more upright than this slant here. So for this one, I'm gonna make it edgy, so I'm gonna use a lot of straight lines and corners. And I'm gonna stay within my baseline and my X height. So you can see here already, instead of making this nice and curved like I did for this H, I'm definitely making these more pointy. And I'm kind of noticing that I'm not really staying consistent in my slant, but that's okay. All right, so then of you. So even though I'm going a little bit quicker here, I'm still being pretty deliberate and intentional about where I'm placing these strokes. I'm not just going super fast and making it look sloppy. I'm thinking about where I want these strokes to go. So for this Y, do that. And then the G, let's just go kind of down like that. Okay, so we can definitely tell a difference between that one and the original. The only thing that was kind of consistent was the slant was being a little bit more upright. Also for this one, I used a little bit less of curves when I was connecting the letters. So like this N comes straight down, like there's a little bit less thought put into the roundness of the connections. Here I was thinking about the connections, but I was definitely making them less rounded than I did on either this one or the traditional one. So I would love to know which of these three styles you like the best. So we have number 1 is traditional, number 2 is modern, and number 3 is edgy. I would love to know which of the three you like the best. And also if there's any tips that I said that really clicked with you or helped you out, I would love to know what those were. So anything that I said today that made you have a light bulb moment or just something that finally made sense, I would love to know in the comments, so just let me know. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in our next lesson.